Practice number 7 of Cleveland Browns 2025 training camp is officially in the books. We have something that we have never seen in a Kevin Stefanski practice before happen today. We've got some business news, a little roster upkeep to talk about. But the biggest thing for me thus point through the 2025 training camp here in Cleveland is there is a rookie star for the Cleveland Browns. And it's not necessarily the guy everybody thinks it is. Browns 3D on the OBR streaming network begins now. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends, your daily delivery of all things Dog Pound Browns 3D on the OBR streaming network. And we appreciate each and every one of you who come to the OBR for your favorite Cleveland Browns content. I am your host, Jeff Lloyd. Head on over to the OBR.com. Fred Greetham has been in Berea about 2 weeks strong now, giving you as many takes as there possibly can be in all the news that is going on. So make sure you're following all of Fred's work at the OBR.com. While you're there at the OBR.com, I highly suggest you jump into and invest into the VIP premium package. You get the insider forums where you will get breaking news, rumors that you're not getting anywhere else. The Ask the Insider aspect, as well as another great feature. And then after a couple of months, you also get Premium Plus along with it. So for a small monetary amount to get the VIP access, you'll also end up with one of the better streaming networks there is. And make sure you're coming out every night to the OBR streaming network beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern with Browns 3D. After us tonight, of course, you will have OBR Weekly, Barry McBride and Fred Greetham giving you all some great info. Jacob Roche will be on after that, and Jacob's summer scouting sessions will be focusing on some of the best tight ends that you will see in college football this fall. Make sure you subscribe to the OBR on YouTube. Of course, make sure you subscribe to the OBR on Twitch. The Browns under Kevin Stefanski have never gone 100% live as far as straight tackling to the ground. That's certainly been questioned at times, and it can work both ways, right? Because in 2023, when the Browns were successful, nobody was questioning whether or not Kevin Stefanski was bringing this type of physicality to his practice sessions. Certainly, 21, 22, 24, when things didn't go necessarily as right, you can use that and say, oh, well, see, that's when you needed to do it. So, I mean, it is a two-way street, the fact that it hasn't been done before. But I think if you can get away without having to do it, that's certainly beneficial. We're only 2 weeks into training camps in the NFL, and you're already seeing the amount of injuries that are, of course, mounting for every team. It's part of it. You know what I'm saying? It's a process. And the thing is you can't just show up and play football games. All these, OTAs and mini camps and, of course, summer camp and of course preseason games. These are a necessity to get yourself ready for the real thing. So as much as it hurts seeing some of your favorite players, get injured, maybe a guy losing a season, it's, nobody wants to see it, but to the preparation to get ready to play a 17-game NFL season is extensive. It is not for the weak of heart by any means whatsoever. Some official news. Martin Emerson, it is a torn Achilles. Martin Emerson is going to have surgery. He has been placed on season-ending IR. So for the time being, essentially ending, his time in Cleveland. He'll be around this team this year. After surgery, rehabbing. Certainly cheering on for his guys. But then, come March, we'll see just exactly where the situation is with Martin Emerson and his future within the NFL. So that opens up one roster spot. Fan favorite, and again, this is another guy where just injuries just never gave him the real chance to fight for a significant amount of playing time. Affectionately referred to by Mikey Trees here at the OBR and certainly throughout the entire OBR community. But wide receiver Mike Woods was placed on waivers with an injury designation. Mike has not participated in a practice since the first practice of training camp with a hand injury. Always a guy that, it seemed every spring and every summer we were trying to amp up. This will be an opportunity for Mike Woods. This could be the year for Mike Woods. Unfortunately, the time is done for Mike Woods here with the Cleveland Browns. And again, not necessarily any fault of Mike Woods' himself. Just unfortunately, the injuries kept mounting and kept mounting. And this is the situation certainly where the Browns have gotten into. So where does that leave? Obviously, the wide receiver room. We know we have Jerry Jeudy. Joe Flacco really seems like he's trying to have a much better relationship with Cedric Tillman here in 2025 than the two guys did in 2023. It was awkward in 2023. Joe had just gotten here. Cedric Tillman, a rookie at the time. The only quarterback he really had any type of rapport with was Dorian Thompson-Robinson, and that wasn't even so much because of the Browns thing. That was because the two of them were high school teammates. Um, Tillman's best game as a rookie, if you go back, actually was the Denver game where DTR started. DTR ultimately took a vicious shot under the chin and, didn't finish the game. And then the way it, certainly parlayed in 23 led to Joe Flacco coming to town. And, Tillman, with some rookie mistakes, just kind of gotten to the point where, Joe Flacco just didn't have much faith in him. And that, of course, kind of zapped any playing time there was going to be for Cedric Tillman. Now the roles are reversed for Tillman here in 2025. He is counted on to be, one of the top producers in that wide receiver room outside of Jerry Jeudy. And while Tillman needs his body, of course, to not basically forsake him, because we know Cedric certainly last year, Tennessee rookie year two, injuries have been something that have really held Cedric Tillman back. But when Cedric gets out there and kind of gets in the flow and and it seems like Tillman's a guy that gets better, kind of like marinates, if you know what I'm saying. The more opportunities, the more balls you throw his way, it kind of seems like Tillman is that guy that can get into a groove. So certainly for Tillman, every one of these practices are of the utmost importance. All the talk on Dawand Johnson to this point has been fantastic. Honestly, if we, taking into account, the personal stuff and, the issues he was having keeping himself on the roster in other places, you know, late into 2023 and of course during 2024. But the Browns have a rejuvenated guy. They have a guy who seems like he's a lot more dialed in right now mentally and emotionally to the game than he certainly was, in 24 and then in 23. And the talent is still there. You see making plays with Joe Flacco, making plays with Dylan Gabriel, making some plays with Shador Sanders. And for Johnson, this could be really key for him, but also key for the Cleveland Browns. The Browns could have just, stumbled into a guy that could give them 60 receptions this year if they gave him the opportunity. So certainly thus far, Jamari Thrash is, certainly not talked about enough, but what you're seeing, it seems like Jamari is, kind of in a nice little groove for himself. There was so much talk all spring. And then, of course, in June about all the work that Jamari Thrash was putting in. Right now, it's kind of looking like it's, starting to maybe pay off. You know, how much of a role can Thrash have? Certainly that depends, on the Tillmans of the world, of the Dawand Johnsons of the world. But for now, Thrash definitely trending in upward trajectory. Wide receiver who's really kind of just in the middle of everything. And, it's probably about time we, give him some flowers. But, Gage Lavardane is involved with everything. You see him, had a, long catch and run, had a catch over the middle today, broke a couple tackles, took it to the house. He's kind of really making a name for himself to this point. Quarterbacks are throwing it to him. They're having faith in him. Again, whether it's Shador, whether it's Joe, whether it's Dylan Gabriel, and you're really kind of getting a nice return out of an undrafted free agent here in Gage Lavardin, who had a nice career for Miami of Ohio and certainly did a couple things down at South Carolina. This could be an early, win maybe for this team. Because I would say, If this were cut down day and, this was a day or 2 before week 1 against the Cincinnati Bengals, of the wide receivers that are currently on this roster for the Browns, you have to think Lavardane would be one of the ones that's gonna be kept. Bunch of guys, Caden Davis is another one that just kinda seems to, just making the most of whatever little opportunities he's given, and this kinda shows you how guys who are lower on the roster find a way to maybe make a roster. You know what I'm saying? You get a couple of things done. Yes, you're not getting a bunch of reps, but if you're positive and catching the balls that are being thrown to you on those limited reps, then all of a sudden there's no other option but to maybe step it up a notch. And for Davis and Lavardane, both of these guys really to this point are really seeming like they're climbing that ladder, so to speak. Starting to see Harold Fannin get into the mix here a little bit. And today it was, out of a, out of a slot set, a little slip screen from Dylan Gabriel. And one thing, and if you remember when we talked about Fannin as a prospect, and then when we talk about Fannin when he actually was drafted by Cleveland, granted, he's not the greatest overall athlete. David Njoku's athletic testing numbers coming out of Miami kind of dwarfed what Harold Fannin's was. One of the most important things that Harold Fannin had for himself is he had a really, really solid 3-cone drill score. And that shows your short area quickness. Now, for Fannin, that is what truly helps him in his yards after catch. Again, not a world beating athlete by any means whatsoever, but his probably best athletic trait with the ball in his hands is his intelligence. And he kind of sees things at a little bit of a quicker pace than other guys do. Now just 21. Again, it's an absolute baby coming into the NFL out of the MAC. His MAC numbers speak for himself. His tape in the MAC, it speaks for itself. Again, it just wasn't against MAC competition. You can ask the guys at Penn State. You can ask the guys at Texas A&M. They all got a real good handful of Harold Fannin. The thing with Fannin, and this is where I think it could be, something that's very beneficial to this team, is we know how much the Browns over the years have always, had the affinity for the 12 personnel, but they maybe never necessarily had it built correctly. Fannin, the blocking is going to take some time. There's no question about that. The Browns could maybe bring in another tight end who's got a, plus block background. And then on other situations with 12 personnel, just go with Njoku and then obviously go, of course, with Harold Fannin. So for Fannin, it's a big jump. There's no question about it. Going from the level of competition he was playing, and where he is now, it certainly helps that he's got a guy like David Njoku who's now going to his 9th season in the NFL. And things weren't always as easy for David when he first got into the NFL. It wasn't necessarily the competition thing, but it was more of in the lines of that, Njoku was still raw, was extremely young. His body was nowhere near where it is now. You know what I'm saying? It takes time to, mold that body, especially when you come into the league at such a young age. And, there's been, times where there were, some guys who you thought would really kind of fit. Harrison Bryant certainly had his moments here with the Browns, but you really think that Fannin would be the one that's going to settle in here and really allow the Browns to really jump into this 12 personnel, which they've always been really successful with. The 12 personnel really works well for the wide zone run calls. It also really works well, obviously, to, disguise the play action off of that wide zone and allow basically to just have some guys wide open, which usually leads to a lot of easy looks for the tight ends. We've seen it in the past with David Njoku. We'll probably see it soon for Harold Fannin. So, for Fannin, it's certainly really, starting to be a little bit of a coming out party here. We're starting to get some pretty good positives, from most of the Cleveland Browns rookies to this point. These guys, I think everything's starting to slow down a little bit. the guys, as they get more knowledgeable and more have a better understanding of either the offensive system or the defensive system, things start to slow down. They get more comfortable. Even when they make mistakes, maybe they tend to be aggressive mistakes as opposed to just blown assignment type of mistakes. And, thus far, the returns are looking pretty good for this Cleveland Browns 2025 draft class. However, and it's probably not however, but if there's one rookie right now from this past April's draft who is literally just taking to the situation like a fish to water, every day I come out of these practices and I come out a bigger and bigger Carson Swessinger fan. Carson Swessinger, you do not see a rep when Carson Swessinger is on the field without him being ultimately in the mix on the play. Swessinger already wearing the green dot, already entrenched as the starting Mike after the news of Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah that came shortly after the draft, which kind of certainly Windexed up the glass as far as to why Swessinger was actually selected by the Browns as high as he was. And the news after, two training camp practices that, Jordan Hicks did decide after a decade in the NFL that it'd just be in his best interest to maybe no longer, pursue his NFL career. But Swessinger certainly has just hit the ground running, and he plays with confidence. He moves with ease. He moves with determination. There's no false steps. And I think one of the things that's really impressive, what you see of Swessinger to this point, is he trusts his eyes. He trusts what he sees. There is a confidence level to Carson Swessinger to this point. He sees what develops, he attacks it, and just goes after it. Carson Swessinger has been an extremely positive contributor this early in training camp. Certainly after the drafting of Swessinger, the belief was that the Cleveland Browns had maybe a loaded linebacker room. We didn't know the full story, of course, on JOK, and certainly had no idea that, Jordan Hicks was, contemplating the biggest decision that he ultimately went ahead and went through with. But the room still has very good potential. Devin Bush, although there could be, some sort of suspension coming Devin Bush's way. Mahmoud Diabate, this is the opportunity he's been working for 2 years with this team, the opportunity for a bigger role. It appears that it'll be there for him. Jerome Baker, again, nobody really talks about the fact that Jerome Baker is here, and it does seem strange, Ohio kid, Ohio State Buckeye. But certainly Jerome Baker, a guy to contribute in that room as well. Somebody that's not necessarily getting a lot of talk in that linebacker room either. And if you're watching, some of the stuff that's being put out the last couple of days, number 40, Buki Watson, last year's 5th-round selection, had been the SEC Defensive Player of the Year that previous year from Mississippi State. Buki Watson's out there getting it done a little bit, and he looks pretty good. He was always a bigger guy, and that's one of the things I'm kind of noticing because with Swessinger, with Buki Watson, these aren't what are your typical size-wise NFL linebackers in 2025. These guys are built a little bit more like an era ago. We're talking 6'2", north of 240. Watson's case probably closer to 250. These guys are bigger, physical linebackers. Granted, Watson does not have the athleticism that Swessinger does. But getting back to Swessinger, and I know everybody's kind of, already ready to anoint and roll with the, kind of the, do you have a Luke Kuechly type of player? And, he's easy on that. All right, let's not go too far on that one. But I'm just absolutely blown away by what I'm seeing this far from, Carson Swessinger, and there's just nothing he's not in on. You see the smarts, you see the intelligence. Obviously, this is a guy who's in the playbook. This is a guy who's in the film. This guy literally takes his job 110% seriously. Like, this is the type of player you draft. You want this type of work ethic. You want this type of commitment. You want this type of desire. And to this point, that is everything you are seeing from Carson Swessinger. So, as much as, people have questioned the Andrew Berry drafts, and look, when you're not having high picks, it's just not that easy. But this 2025 class, where the Browns did have several high selections, other than one who is not with us yet, the rest of this rookie class, they look to be, in it and performing, I would say maybe ahead of expectations. We're only 7 practices in, and Carson Swessinger is dominating as the Mike linebacker for this Cleveland Browns defense. The quarterback competition, and we're not there yet. I think it's safe to say we can just go with that. We're not there yet. You know, Joe, and for Joe Flacco, this is being handled exactly how it should be, in my opinion. We all know of Joe's age, and, yes, Joe has a howitzer of a right arm, but there's, no reason and very little expectation to believe that Joe Flacco at his age could just be out there dominating the practice reps. It would be foolish to do so. It's pretty obvious at this point. It's not going to be announced, but it's pretty obvious at this point that Joe Flacco is your week 1 starter. For every practice that Kenny Pickett misses, whether or not the team wants to confirm it or the team wants to say it, the more time Kenny Pickett misses, the further and further away I think Kenny Pickett not only gets from the starting position, Kenny Pickett gets from actually being with the Cleveland Browns roster in week 1. It's kind of the way I always felt how this was going to work out. It does seem, obviously like a crappy situation for Kenny Pickett that, injury is part of it. Certainly did not get his fair shot due to injury. It's just the way things go sometimes. And, not the way I expected it to, work for Pickett. Not that I'm going to stand here and, jump up and down for a I was right type of scenario, because you never want to see that for any player whatsoever. But again, the further and further Kenny Pickett gets from taking snaps, you know, the more it probably just seals his fate. Gabriel, and everybody knows of the two. Obviously, I'm on the stance of, I think Shador Sanders is the better player. And there's some things I see at times from Shador that I already see, I think, that are noticeable improvement from what I saw at Colorado. I think Shador is, and this was one of my biggest critiques of him at Colorado was, the ball just holding it too long, pass rush. And again, his offensive line stank. But pass rush was just a severe issue. And I think Shador has really, really put in a lot of effort in kind of establishing his reads, understanding where the ball is going to go, and just moving with alacrity to get the ball out of his hands as quickly as possible. If he thought he was seeing a lot of pressure in Colorado, I think he's really starting to understand the amount of pressure he would see here in the NFL. Certainly, you believe the Cleveland Browns offensive line will be better than the Colorado Buffaloes offensive line will be. But either way, Shador, the utmost importance certainly is ball security and getting the ball out. And look, if the guy's only open by a half a yard, that may be the best guy you got. Guys in the NFL, while catching the ball at full speed, are expected to get yards after the catch. Not everything is just going to be done through the arm of the quarterback. Now, Gabriel, the thing with Dylan Gabriel is I think you get 2, 3, 4 good reps, and then you'll get a 4th rep where it was just like, it's either a bad ball. I know Shelby Harris got him once today on a bat down. Not much you can do about that. But there were, a couple of bads, and then he ripped one to Caden Davis for 40 yards. So there's definitely ups and downs. He had the slip screen to Harold Fannin that I mentioned earlier. He had the touchdown pass to Gage Lavardane, who broke a couple tackles, took it. But, at times there's just issues with Gabriel where it just kind of looks like, again, there's times where I watch and I don't know if NFL quarterback is necessarily there for Dylan Gabriel. Um, The more comfortable he gets within this offense certainly probably aids him. The Browns have obviously been waxing very poetic, about what they think about Gabriel as far as, the professionalism, the dedication, dedicated to his craft. All that stuff is something the Browns have been pretty vocal about. So the more entrenched into the playbook and the more comfortable that Dylan Gabriel gets, I think he'll have a better understanding of just what exactly he can and cannot accomplish. This Browns quarterback room, it's probably, it was an early practice here on Wednesday, got off the field early. Hopefully it works out where, these guys, get some rest, kind of get your legs back under you. This first couple of days with some pads on certainly aren't the smoothest days. Thursday is an off day. Then, with that rest and relaxation from a day and a half, you can get back to hopefully some pretty positive business on Friday, of course. So the quarterback competition is certainly, the focal point of this 2025 training camp to see if we can even get adequate enough quarterback play to the point where we can even say, can the Browns be a team that's going to medal somewhere around 500 here in 2025? Yes, I do think is a very big stretch. I do. And, you do wonder with some of the struggles on the offensive side of the ball here, whether or not the defense is just that far ahead, or is it a sign that maybe the defense is just that good? Certainly something, to think about. Dawand Jones did leave practice a little early today, was not necessarily on the cart, was riding shotgun in the cart. And basically it was, Dawand was just kind of dismissed a little early from practice today. Big man was having a little trouble with the heat. But all signs seem okay. I have no questions about it. We've spent many, many times talking about the commitment that Dawand Jones has put in to doing a better job of honing his body. So for Dawand Jones, maybe just a blip on the radar screen. Um, First look at cornerback today with a life without Martin Emerson. Greg Newsome pretty much is lined up outside for everything. Um, Cameron Mitchell is first one trying to get these nickel reps here today. Did lose a couple of battles thus far. Miles Harden did not get an opportunity as he was, admitted from he was excused from practice today. So not exactly sure what the reasoning is for Miles Harden, but was absent but excused. So Miles Harden hopefully back to the team for Friday's practice. Um, Again, I'll keep telling you, maybe just keep your eyes on Nick Needham in this situation. Nick Needham is not a world-class athlete. Nick Needham is not going to just do some things on the field that just, make you just blow you away with pure athleticism. Nick Needham is just a really darn good football player with a really high football IQ and just kind of has the football intelligence to be where he needs to be. It certainly was on display at times early with the Miami Dolphins after the regime change, the coaching change. He kind of ended up being a guy on the outside looking in on a secondary in Miami that is currently, for the Dolphins currently, they're redoing their entire secondary between losses and injury. The entire Dolphins secondary has been turned 180 degrees upside down. Um, my thing with Newsome, and I said yesterday, there could be the opportunity where Newsome just goes full time to the outside, which, as much as it hurts for, Newsome and his buddy that Martin Emerson is out for the year, this has kind of been an opportunity Greg Newsome was kind of hoping for the last couple of years. And certainly in a contract year where Greg Newsome wants to prove his worth to somebody to hopefully give him, a nice big deal off of his rookie deal, the opportunity should be there now on the outside. And the question then would be is, are there going to be weeks where Greg Newsome kicks inside because, that week's opponent has a, slot weapon that is just too much to handle for the normal Browns nickel. Again, I said there are 2 roster spots open. I'm really hoping, and I've told you, I think there's teams that have wide receivers that can be had for the right draft capital. The Browns really need to get somebody else into this wide receiver room. So if they want to get on that and get on that before Friday's practice, that would be fantastic. The other roster spot could be, could be another corner. Until we know more about Kenny Pickett, do the Browns bring in just one more quarterback just to maybe absorb some reps so you're not overworking anybody here, or bring in another quarterback because, are you going to give, if Joe's not playing in preseason games, which I don't think is going to happen, are you basically going to say then that 12 quarters of preseason action, Shador is going to get 6 and Dylan Gabriel is going to get 6? It's not a terrible approach, but I'd rather have somebody here just in case to maybe take some reps in those preseason games if, God forbid, something was going on with either Shador Sanders or, of course, with Dylan Gabriel. We appreciate you all for coming out to the OBR every day. Head on over to the OBR.com. Check out that VIP subscription. You get, of course, the Insider Forums. You get the Ask the Insider Forums. You can have your questions answered directly by all of us here at the OBR. Make sure you look into that, of course. The OBR streaming network beginning every night at 6 p.m. begins with Browns 3D, of course, hosted by me, Jeff Lloyd. Today is Wednesday. You'll get Fred and Barry with OBR Weekly at 7 o'clock. Jacob Roche at 8 with a summer scouting series focusing on the tight end class of the 2026 NFL Draft. So make sure you stick around, check out all of that. And of course, all that being said, this has been your daily delivery of all things Dog Pound Browns 3D on the OBR streaming network. And we will talk to you all tomorrow.